Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this RuDASA webinar. We are speaking about the need to feed this evening, nature versus nurture, and we're going to talk about the great obesity debate. I'm Dr. Madeleine Muller, and I work as a family physician at Mdantsane at Cecilia Makiwane Hospital. And recently, we decided we need to do something about our lifestyle modification advice to our patients. So we have medical students and interns, and whenever we talk about diabetes or hypertension or any of these topics, we always tell our students, please give lifestyle advice and tell our patients to lose weight. And I think we actually fail dismally, and the majority of our patients do not lose weight, and those that do lose weight do not sustain any weight loss. And so one sort of starts wondering, why are we making all this fuss? And so actually we got to the point where we thought, let's take it a step up, and together with dietitians, actually they're doing most of the work, we decided to set up a weight loss clinic at Mdantsane. So this is in a big urban suburb, and the first thing we discovered is it took us about 3 or 4 months to actually just get 10 people together who was willing to come. And we realized, well, actually, maybe weight loss clinics might not be the way to go. But we had decided when we set it up, and we are going to be writing it up as a protocol and hopefully publishing on our experiences of trying to run a weight loss clinic here in Mdantsane. And part of this was a literature review with a bunch of us starting to really look and trying to understand what has changed in our understanding of weight and weight loss. And actually, the world has changed dramatically in the last decade. And that's partly what has motivated us to really start putting together some information around this. And what I'm hoping to do is try and find some kindred spirits out there in our urban and rural areas to really start looking at this question practically. Actually, when we talk about this, do we understand enough about weight and weight loss to really be able to actually have an impact? And the big question is, does it really matter? Which is what we're going to be looking at quite a bit today. So I'm going to be covering lots of different aspects. It's going to be quite a scientific talk because it was out of a literature review. And we're going to, of course, start off with the issue of this whole BMI phenomenon that we have and some of the issues we have with BMIs, and then really start delving into the genetics of how weight works and everything around that. We'll look a little bit about how that all comes together and influencing weight gain. And then we'll look at what's been happening in what they now call the obesogenic environment for the last 10, 15 years, where this has really shifted in the world internationally. And then lastly, we will be very practical and actually look at how do we think about the patient in front of us. So when we went and looked, there's a lot written, obviously an extraordinary amount written about understanding weight. But the person that I'm going to be quoting a lot, so I thought I'll just give him credit right at the beginning, is Dr. Giles Yeo, and you'll see there he's got an MBE, so I'm not sure if I should call him Prof or Sir, but he's from the University of Cambridge, and he's a professor in molecular neuroendocrinology at the MRC Metabolic Diseases Unit, and he's also the scientific director of genomics and something called transcriptomics core, and he's been looking extensively at understanding the genetics of weight. And so a lot of the science I've been drawing from him. And what's been really nice is he's written these 2 great books, which is sort of the general public, so not so hard to slog through than the journals, where he actually puts a lot of very good science into some very understandable terminology. So one of the issues that was interesting also when we were starting to put up the weight loss clinic is there's this big emphasis, especially in family medicine, about weight management and lifestyle modification. And yet there's also been a lot of talk recently in terms of fat shaming and making people feel bad about what they weigh. And so within the newspapers, there's this constant controversies, this tension between obesity and weight loss, and we should help people lose weight. And on the other side, hold on, we are shaming people for their size, and does it really matter? And should we not actually be celebrating people for who they are rather than making people feel bad about who they are? And I think one of the challenges is with how we look, our weight, the way we eat, and the food choices we make is very visible to the world. And there's a lot of criticism on people on how they behave around food. And this has become really problematic in the world of today. And so, of course, the first question is this whole messy body mass index thing. And we all have them, right? Everybody who comes through our doors gets a nice little BMIs and the exams presented when you do your anthropomorphic assessment. And actually, BMI's got no evidence in terms of helping us understanding health. So when we do BMIs, it does not tell us anything about the risk of our patient. It does not tell us anything about the health of our patient at the moment, or what the health of our patient is going to be like in the future. And the indicators are very broad and very rough at the best. So this classification of 25 to 30 and 30 to 35 and 35 is not based on anything substantial. It is literally just a numbers game. And this has become an issue because we put a lot of emphasis on, oh my goodness, you've got a BMI of 27, you are now overweight, and therefore you need to have a BMI of, say, the ideal 23, 24, and actually there's no evidence that everybody needs to be that weight to be healthy. What's more important is not how much we weigh, but the nature of that weight. And there's two things we're going to look at. So the first is, and I think we're all becoming more and more aware of this, is about where we store fat. So subcutaneous fat is sort of our long storage fat stores that we all have, and much more common in the female genomes to predominantly store their fat in the subcutaneous tissue. So that's right underneath the skin there. You can see there's a nice little diagram there. So typically hips, bum, arms, face, tummy, it's got all this nice little padding that is good places for fat to go. They'll often call it wobbly fat. So you have that, in the gyms, they will see how much your underarm wobbles to give you an idea of your subcutaneous fat. And what's important with this fat is this is fat that our body, it's ideally designed for long-term storage. So it's actually quite hard to shift. The body doesn't want to give up its subcutaneous fat. It's there for a reason. It's great for heat, for example, and it's great for preservation in case of, that next famine that's about to come. And it's actually got very low inflammation and very low impact on health. So subcutaneous fat overall is part of the healthy human body. Visceral fat, of course, is a different story. And what's interesting is we see it more in the male genome. So typically in the beer belly is always the archetypal sort of definition of it. And now you have fat that's actually sitting more around the organs, and it's sitting here on the inside of those abdominal muscles. So that is why beer bellies are quite firm. You can't get that like love handle squeeze as you can with your subcutaneous fat. But the interesting is the reason why we have visceral fat is that this fat is much more mobile than subcutaneous fat. So if you're going to go, for example, on a massive hunt and you're going to be running for 3 days, chasing down an animal, as we do, or maybe you're going to be running away in a war for battle and not be able to stop anywhere to eat, then you're able to mobilize energy from visceral fat very, very quickly. So the advantage of this is that it's easy to shift. So also if you have that type of fat accumulation and you decide to go on, for example, a diet or exercise, that fat's much easier to shift than subcutaneous fat. But this fat is also much more inflammatory. So there's still a lot of research trying to understand why this fat is so different, but it has got higher inflammatory markers. It's got a different hormone profile. And we know that this is directly linked to cardiovascular risk factors and inflammation that leads to cardiovascular disease. So visceral fat is great for, the young person who needs some emergency energy stores, but it's not very good on the long run. So this is an important message that subcutaneous fat is not unhealthy. It's part of who human beings are. And our obsession with looking at the scale is not helpful for our patients. So for example, here's a nice little picture of 2P belly, or that sort of what they call the apple-shaped body versus the pear-shaped body. And this one, the apple-shaped body, has actually got a much higher risk than the pear-shaped body. But of course, it can't be that you can endlessly pick up weight and stay completely healthy. There must be a limit. And so there is something that we call lipo-toxicity, which is that once your fat stores once you have a bit too much fat on board, that in itself can become unhealthy. And this is where it gets tricksy. So we have these fat cells in our body, mostly sitting subcutaneously, which gets filled with triglycerides when we store fat. It's a nice little picture of a fat cell on the right here, and you can see it's got its own mitochondria and a whole little energy system as well. So fat cells themselves also need energy. But what's interesting is that every human being is born with a specific maximum number of fat cells. So you don't make more fat cells as you grow bigger. Once your fat cells basically blow up like little bubbles, and when they're full, they're full. And the interesting thing is that once you get to the point where all your fat cells are full, you can't make more fat cells, and the fat has to be stored in different places. So also they can then be stored viscerally around the organs, which we know can be problematic, but they can also go and sit in the muscles and in the liver. And if you've got lipids laid down between your muscle cells, it interferes with the glucose getting into those cells. Your body has to make a lot more insulin to get those glucose into the cells, and eventually that can burn out that pancreas and lead to diabetes. So you've got a maximum capacity of how much fat you can store before it starts becoming toxic to you as a person. And the problem is that amount of capacity is genetically determined and varies. And what we can't do at the moment is we're very bad at being able to identify for a specific person in front of us how much fat is too much. So we do know that with certain, for example, genomes in your East Asian people, so your Chinese and your South Asian people from India or Pakistan, some of those constitutions have got much less fat cells and so much less capacity. So they can actually be a much lower weight and become have risk for cardiovascular disease or develop diabetes at a much lower weight. So this is one of the challenges, is that we do not understand individually for this person in front of us, is this a problem or not? And you might have somebody with a BMI of 32, mostly subcutaneous fat, who's actually 100% healthy and will never get ill because of the weight that they are carrying. So of course, because of that, we've already started shifting, and I think the shift is happening much better overseas than it is in South Africa. So we're already getting good at using waist circumference, for example, as a way, and we really should be rather, getting rid of the BMIs at entry and really be focusing on waist circumference as explaining to us when patients are at risk. And we're already getting a little bit more differentiated with our waist circumferences. So you can see this is from Canada, where they've got different cutoffs of the waist circumference depending on where you are from. And there's a question on how we can get more and more granular with this kind of information. Some people are also now starting to look at different ratios of the waist circumference. So a popular ratio that's on a lot of research at the moment is the weight to height, just because it's very simple to measure. But I think what gets really interesting is the waist to hip ratio, because then you can really start seeing this difference between visceral versus subcutaneous fat. Around your waist circumference can both be influenced by visceral fat and by subcutaneous fat. And the way we can make the difference is understanding the waist to hip ratio. And I think this kind of charts will become where we'll be going in the next decade, so that you will be using this rather than the old-fashioned BMI or even old-fashioned just waist circumference to decide which of our patients might have a higher risk, although it's still not giving us all of the information. So let's move on a little bit now on our actual eating and energy side. And I'm going to cover a little bit of the biology of understanding how energy works. And I think this formula needs to still be out there, because there's a lot of diet advice that tends to believe that this formula is not true. But if you eat more calories than you burn, you're definitely going to gain weight. And it doesn't matter where those calories come from. So it doesn't matter whether if you're eating Mars bars all day, if you eat less Mars bars than you burn, then you will lose weight. If you eat carrots all day and you eat more carrots and calories than you burn, then you will pick up weight. So that equation on a bodily level is irrefutable. So I'm very academic scientific slide for you that are not interested. You can shut off for 2 seconds. And it's just a little bit to look at how our body uses energy. And in we've got 37 trillion cells in our body, and every single cell of our body needs energy all the time to do whatever it is it's doing, even if it's just meaning to stay alive. And the way that energy is supplied is through a little battery called ATP. So this little battery has got a triphosphate bond in it. And when the battery gets used, when the energy gets used, there's actually one of these phosphate bonds that gets broken and then becomes ADP, called ADP. And then when you add your extra phosphate bond from a diphosphate to a triphosphate, then that becomes ATP, or adenosine triphosphate molecule, which is a storage capacity for energy. So when we talk about energy, we have these trillions and trillions of little batteries in every single cell of our body that provides us. And these batteries have to be continuously charged. So to be able to do that, we need to get in energy from the world outside of us to charge our batteries, literally. And our food obviously comes in these three main types of molecules that provides us with potential energy. So we can burn three different things for energy. We can burn protein, we can burn carbs, and we can burn fat. And they get broken into their smaller components. For those of you who are interested, go and look at Giles's books. He gets very technical, but we know that amino acids, glucose, fatty acids are those basic blocks that's going to be absorbed from the gut into our bodies. And then interestingly, all three of these, through different chemical processes, are going to be turned into acetyl-CoA, which is like the coal for our energy stations. So that is a fuel that we use, but that fuel is made out of whatever we eat. And the body is not particularly fussy as long as it can get its acetyl-CoA fuel. This acetyl-CoA is then put into our mitochondria through our good old-fashioned Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation. So it actually gets burnt up with a bit of oxygen. That's going to make this energy. And with that energy, we're going to charge that little ATP batteries, which we're then going to use. Interesting to note is that if we make acetyl-CoA and there's acetyl-CoA that's not needing to be used up for ATP, then that can be converted back and be stored at fat. And that doesn't matter where it comes from. So whether we eat proteins or carbs or fat, all of that can be still stored at fat if we've got too much energy available. So those of you that are into calorie counting will be aware of these little numbers at the bottom. And that just shows us that each of this protein that we eat is going to be converted to calories. What's interesting about the calorie, so that's the unit that we measure for energy in the food that we are eating. And the interesting thing with calories is that the typical amounts that we know is how we measure it when we take that calorie. So if we take protein and we put it through this fancy thing called a bomb calorimeter, to measure how much calories is in it before we eat it, then we find that every gram of protein consists of about 4 calories, every gram of carbs also about 4 calories, and every gram of fat about 9 calories. But this is not the whole story. And once it goes through the body, there's quite a lot that happens in terms of knowing how much available calories do we actually have. And I'll touch on that briefly as we go on. So when we talk about fuel, we've got all this fuel coming into the body. And the body's very good at having two processes that happens completely separately. The one is us eating food and the food being made into coal and being made ready to be used and charge these batteries. And on the other side, there's the batteries that are actually providing the energy for everything that's happening. And the two are actually quite unrelated to each other and uninterested in each other. And so what happens is that when we eat, a lot of these nutrients just get stored, ready to be used and broken down into acetyl-CoA when needed. So there's two major places of storage. So there's glycogen that gets stored in our muscles and our liver. And that's typically sugar that gets stored like that. And sugar is a priority fuel because it can be released very quickly. And for some organs like the brain that cannot use fat, it specifically has to be made available for specific organs. So we do need some glycogen on board, but it's a very inefficient way to store energy. It needs a lot of water to store every gram of sugar. And therefore, we only store about 2,000 calories in our muscles and liver. And that can get used up within 30 to 40 hours. If you're fasting, you will use up all the glycogen in your muscles and your liver, and you'll have to start making new glycogen to replace it. And then our fat storage is much more efficient. So you can store a lot of fat in a small space. The average person carries about 18 to 20 kilograms of fat at any one time. And that gives us about 9,000 to 18,000 calories, which can cover you for about 72 to 90 days of energy if you need it. And it obviously gets released a bit slower. So what do we use this energy for? We've got a basal metabolic rate that needs to use up some of these calories. So this typically is like when you are not doing anything. So you're lying quietly in your bed, you haven't eaten, it's a nice normal temperature, then this is the certain amount of calories that you need just to keep alive and keep your body metabolizing. And that's a good 60 to 75% of your calories every day gets used just for your basal metabolic rate. The bigger you are, whether it's in height or size or even fat, the higher your basal metabolic rate. So somebody who weighs 90 kilograms will need more calories because they've got more cells than somebody who weighs 60 kilograms, for example. Physical activity, depending on what you use, can take up a good 15 to 30% of your calories, and that's any activity. So including fidgeting or scrubbing, or, itching your nose or shivering when you're cold, all counts as that kind of activities. And then there's this interesting sort of little section called diet-induced thermogenesis, which is a good 10% of our energy use every day. And that is just the energy we need to metabolize all the food we eat. So what's interesting is that some food needs more energy to metabolize it. So protein consists of 22 different amino acids. They all have different ways of getting digested. And therefore, they need a lot more energy to be broken down, for example, than carbs, and fats needs very little energy at all. And so when I mentioned earlier that actually your available calories are a little bit less because of the amount of energy that gets used to burn up those particular micronutrients. So when we do exercise and when we do physical activity, say you decide you're going to take a sprint down the beach, then that ATP, all of that trillions of little bits of ATPs that's sitting in all of your muscle cells actually gets used up very quickly, within 2 to 4 seconds. Got another little system called phosphocreatinine that's got some phospho bonds as well. And within the first 10 seconds, you've used up all of those little batteries, charged batteries in your body, and you very, very quickly need to charge those up again. And that is where glycolysis come in. So that's why you've got that extra little bit of glycogen available in your muscles that can be broken down very quickly, very inefficiently, but can give you some energy while you're waiting for your fat system to actually kick in. So as soon as you start exercising, your fat burning system already kicks in, but it's going to take at least a minute or so before that's going to start releasing energy. So that's typically if you're lifting a very heavy weight and you start getting that burn in your muscles, is because you're starting to run out of your first sort of minute of emergency supply of energy. So there we go. Very basic, brief 2-minute overview of energy use. Reason why I'm explaining all of this is to show how different, therefore, different people's caloric needs are. So it's going to depend on your body size. So as I said, smaller people need less and bigger people need more. Your sex is going to make a difference. We have different types of bodies, your biological sex. Your activity levels is going to have quite a dramatic effect on how much calories you need. And as we grow older, our bodies also use energy differently. We have less bits that needs to be kept young. And we therefore actually need less calories as we grow older, and we also become a little bit more sedentary in the way we move a little bit slower maybe than we did when we were younger. And therefore there's a very wide range of how many calories somebody might need in a day just to be able to cover their basic energy use. Okay, easy. So quite often people say, well, is there something as a fast metabolism? And there's this little bit of a myth that there's some people out there that can eat as much as they like and they will never pick up weight. But the reality is that the way we use on a cell level, a muscle cell or a muscle cell, they use energy very much in similar ways. A fitter person's muscle cells will be a bit more efficient. But on a cellular level, there's not much difference in terms of what happens with energy use. What does differ is how much we as individuals move and our movement patterns. So, for example, some people are more fidgety, some people are more anxious and will move differently. Some people's personalities are more hurried. Some people are constitutionally more, got jiggly legs or just more up and down, struggles to sit still. People who are fitter will tend to move faster or tend to take the stairs instead of the lift. There's lots of different ways in how we actually use energy. People's bodies are also differently energy efficient, meaning that some people are better at conserving energy. Should be a good thing, right? But that means also it'll be harder to lose weight. And of course, aging bodies and ill bodies are also going to use energy differently. So although there's a lot of question in terms of being able to understand how do we figure out how many calories a specific person needs every single day. But this rule in the bottom never changes. So it doesn't matter how many calories you consume. If you're eating more calories than you are burning, you are going to gain weight. And people who seem to just stay thin are either eating a little bit less, or actually they might be moving more and burning that off in other ways. So now we get a little bit to the crux of this, the need to feed, as I call it, and to talk about our feeding behavior as human beings. And to be able to understand our feeding behavior, we have to understand a little bit our unconscious survival brain, which is our limbic system. And our survival brain's purpose, our genetic purpose, is basically to keep us alive until we reproduce. Yay! And after that, who cares? And we have certain reflexes that's been built, drives that's been built into us. So as human beings, to stay alive, we try and avoid pain. So we've got our fight, freeze, flight system. We seek out things that we find rewarding, or we seek out pleasure. And all of these things are there to keep us alive and keep us safe. So classically, it's food, sex, security, troop, power, all those very basic survival instincts. And food is a very big part of that unconscious drive. And then the third one that I'm just keeping in to keep it complete is our desire to conserve energy, that I really can't be asked part of ourselves. And Dr. Steve Peters, who's a psychiatrist, he wrote a lovely book that specifically looks at these drives, and he calls that our inner chimp. And we're going to talk a little bit about this inner chimp, which is this inner part of us that's main purpose is to avoid pain and to seek pleasure. So when we talk about hunger, and I'm calling it the need to feed, because hunger often makes us think that it's because we need food. But actually, the need to feed is a key subconscious drive that our bodies has developed over time. And the drive is to ensure that we have enough energy stores on board. That is why that drive has been genetically developed. And the idea is that if there's ever a famine, then we'll be fine. Or if we suddenly have to, run 3 days to hunt a bear or run away for 3 days to avoid some enemy, then at least we'll have enough energy on board. What's important about this is that the need to feed has got nothing to do with our daily caloric requirement. So our hunger is not related to when did I last eat or do I have enough calories on board. As we've seen from our energy use, we've got more than enough calories on board to last us for 72 to 90 days. And if we were completely fasting, just our glucose in our body cells, we've got enough there for more than a day to keep us going. So our need to feed has got much more to do with genetically trying to create a buffer for hard times. It's a drive to store energy. So to be able to do this, the body is quite clever. So we have this whole genetic system that gives feedback to our appetite center. And again, here's a little bit of science. So we've got the hypothalamus, which is where the appetite center is based. And it gets very complex because there's more than 100 genes that's involved in the various feedback systems that affect our appetite center and basically either is the pedal or the brake in either making you very hungry or actually stopping you from being hungry. There's a few genes that's become very exciting. So the one that a lot has been written about is the MC4R gene, because it's a specific gene that they could identify. And if you've got a deletion of one or the complete partial or complete part of this gene, then your appetite center will not get very good feedback in terms of switching off. So basically, you're much hungrier than the average population. Now, interestingly, in the study that came out, and this was a study done through Prof. Yeo, they found that 1% of people with a BMI over 30 has this gene. So to put that into context, in the USA, more than 100 million people have a BMI over 30. So that means about 1 million people in America can be assumed to have this gene as a direct reason for why they have a higher BMI. And interestingly enough, Labradors also have a partial deletion of the MC4R. So if you wonder why Labradors seem to me more hungry than the average dog and seem to be keeping on more weight, it's because of their genetic predisposition. But even if you don't have a single gene like that one can identify, there's a whole spectrum of genes that actually feeds back on and setting your level of hunger and your level of drive. And to be able to get that feedback, your hypothalamus asks several questions. It wants to know how much energy I'm using. So if you are doing exercise, you are running, then it's also going to be making you hungrier. It wants to know how much fat's already on board. So there is another gene called leptin, leptin deficiency, which is a genetic illness that means that, so leptin backtrack, sorry, leptin is created by your fat cells to let your appetite center know how much fat you have. And some people don't have that. It's a very small percentage, and it causes an extraordinary ravenous hunger, and you're willing to eat anything. And usually, because it's genetic, they're from birth, it's usually children by 5, 6, 7 years old. People, literally mothers, have to put locks on their doors, and these children become morbidly obese very quickly. Once they've identified this gene, they're now giving these children daily leptin injections, and that actually helps them to reduce that hunger. Interestingly, giving leptin to people who don't have the leptin deficiency makes no difference. But the other thing very important, and we're going to talk quite a bit about that, is that you need feedback in terms of how much have you eaten. So, you know, how much food am I taking in on board? Am I taking in enough food to be able to satisfy this need to feed? And to be able for that feedback system, there's quite a vast amount of hormones that gets made through the gut. So you get feedback already from the stomach, from the duodenum, all the way through. But some of the hormones that has the biggest effect on appetite is the gut hormones in the ileum. So that is the lower part of the small gut, just before it goes into the colon. And there's a host of them. The sexy one we'll talk about quite a bit today is GLP-1. So that's a particular hormone created by the gut that then affects various parts of the body. And also the fiber that gets digested by various bacteria creates something called short chain fatty acids. And these also have an effect on the bacterial, on the appetite system in the hypothalamus. Oh, it's very technical. So the important thing is that all of us has all these interesting feedback mechanisms, and these are all determined by this genetic makeup that we have. So this explains the dessert stomach. Here we go. Now, finally, some interesting science. Right. So you all know about the dessert stomach, right? You've gone out for supper and somebody has, you know, you've got a lovely big steak and chips and you've had an amazing meal and you're full, you're stuffed, right? And the waiter comes along, and if he was to offer you another steak, you would go, no, okay, I am full. I definitely do not need to eat another, you know, anything more. And then he brings the dessert menu and you go, oh, maybe a little, you know, chocolate mousse would be very nice. So the dessert stomach is a very beautiful illustration of that need to feed. So what's happening is the body is trying to maximize the amount of carbs and fats that it takes in, trying to take the most concentrated calories in it can possible so that it can hoard as much energy as it can. And a beautiful example of this in nature are the bears up in the northern Scandinavian countries. So every year, just before the winter, as you know, the bears hibernate through winter, and they have in these beautiful rivers in Scandinavia, they've got these salmon that actually swim upriver. You get this, like, it's a bit like our sardine runs, but this glut of salmon that comes up the rivers, and the bears gorge themselves on the salmon. What's interesting is at some point they get completely stuffed. They've had too much salmon, they're completely full. And what they start doing is they eat just the skin. They literally just take the skin off the salmon, which is the fattiest part of that fish. And so it shows how the bear is already instinctively craving just that fatty bit, even though they've eaten enough to be able to try and bring as much calories on board and get as much weight as possible to get them through the winter. So now we know why we need that, you know, extra brownie after supper. So let's put this all together and start looking at weight gain. And there's a reason why I've got this beautiful Polynesian god up there. He's the Polynesian god Maui from the movie and the Disney movie Moana. And the Polynesians is going to give us a good illustration of trying to explain all of this a little bit better. So there's a theory, and it's actually called the set point theory, which is proposed by Prof. Yayo and his team, that every human being actually has a set point, like a genetically predestined weight. So your body has decided this is what weight you need to be safe in case there's going to be a famine. And a good example of these are the Polynesians. So the Polynesians are on these beautiful little islands, but very isolated from the rest of the world. And so very many hundreds and thousands of years ago, if there was a disaster or a famine, they would not have been able to move anywhere else to access food. And so therefore, those that had a genetic predisposition to gain a lot more extra weight was actually therefore much more likely to survive. So those with who had a higher set point for their predestined weight was genetically advantaged. What's interesting now in the Polynesian people, and there's an island called Nauru, I think, when 95% of the people are overweight, 45% of them are obese, and they're not necessarily unwell. So this is a healthy genetic weight that they take. What makes it all interesting is, so when Disney, before I tell you about Disney, so when we look at human beings on average across the board, people gain about 15 kilograms from when they're 20 years old. By the time they get to 50, we all gain about an average of 15 kilograms. Some people obviously don't gain it all. Some people gain 30, but it all comes out in the wash. And over time, everybody gets heavier because that's what your body wants to do. To be able to gain just that 15 kilograms over that 20 to 50 years, all you need to do is eat an extra 35 calories a week, which is not very much. That's not even a bite of a Mars bar. And it only needs a little bit of a need to feed to actually help you slowly and steadily gain that weight. So let's get to Disney. So Disney brought out this lovely movie with this big, beautiful Polynesian god, and he might be your ancestor. How do you know? So this set point that the Polynesians have is not related to what's related to their health long-term necessarily, but is related to their environment. And so look at this headline that came out when the Disney movie came out. So it was said that the portrayal of the god Maui has prompted a debate over unhealthy stereotypes of Polynesian men on screen. And so we can start having a whole debate around fat shaming and what is considered unhealthy, and what we should or should not be putting out there as what is normal and what is acceptable for human beings to look like. So what happens over time is that we all pick up weight slowly, because that's what we're supposed to be doing. And then, of course, as human beings, especially if you live in environments where we're now all supposed to, like, I don't know, be on a BMI of under 25, you'll decide at some stage, no, I need to follow my doctor's advice and I'm going to lose some weight. And when you lose weight, you can see in this graph on the right there, the body actually panics because genetically, no, that's not the plan. We're supposed to now feed up here. And so what happens is when you're dieting or when you're on a diet, you're going to increase your need to feed. So you're going to start feeling much hungrier than you normally are. And your body's going to get very clever at conserving energy to try and make sure that it doesn't lose weight. And so what tends to happen, and this time is quite, there's like one person trying to lose weight, and then the weight comes back up and there might even be a little bit of a rebound, and then they try and lose weight again. But then eventually, by the time you reach for your 40s or 50s, you've reached this specific weight that your body is trying to be. And I think in some people's lives, this line is very squiggly, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, as one sort of continuously fighting this weight that wants to be gained. So the challenge with the need to feed is that every single day we make several food decisions, right? When you're shopping for food, when you're eating out and you're on the go, when you're cooking at home. And if your need to feed is activated, it actually drives decisions which are mostly unconscious. So we can control our need to feed. So we don't only have a survival system, we've got this prefrontal control system. But this system is a bit slower than our unconscious system. You have to be conscious. You have to go, oh, no, not buying that today. And what's interesting is we actually use a lot more energy when we engage this higher parts of our brain to control. So self-control itself needs energy. It literally needs glucose, and it burns more sugar in the brain when you're trying to make decisions like that. So that means our self-control gets impaired whenever we are tired, whenever we feel stressed, anxious, or emotional, or whenever we're mentally and physically ill. And I'm sorry, nobody goes through a day or a week where you don't have times when you are too tired to now try and make, sensible decisions around food choices versus what your need to feed is driving for. Back to the dessert stomach example. So that brings us to our obesogenic environment, right? So we've got the need to feed, genetically determined. And of course, there's been a lot of debate saying, well, how can we say it's genetics? Because if it's genetics, why in the last 30 years have everything changed? And this is a lovely graph from America. You can see